The dog hit the end of his chain so hard the steel cage shook. 95 pounds of Belgian Malinois teeth bared spit, flying eyes locked on the woman standing 12 feet away. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even look at him like he was dangerous. She looked at him like she already knew him. 30 Navy SEALs stood watching in stunned silence. Nobody made a sound, because that dog Rex had already put 3 handlers on the ground. And this woman, she'd been on base for exactly 4 hours. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The morning Lena Cross arrived at combat training facility Echo 7, nobody came to meet her. That was intentional. She'd been told to report to the K9 operations building by 0700. She got there at 0645, standing outside in the Arizona heat, with one duffel bag, a set of orders printed on standard military paper, and a name tag that said nothing about who she actually was. The duty sergeant, a thick-necked man named Briggs, looked at her paperwork for a long time. Longer than necessary. He turned it over, checked the back, then looked up at her with an expression that sat somewhere between bored and flat-out skeptical. "Cross?" he said. "Lena Cross. That's me. You're the new handler attachment." That's what the orders say. Briggs set the papers down on his desk and leaned back in his chair. He looked her over the way a man looks at something he's already decided isn't worth his time. She was 26 years old, 5'4", 130 pounds with her boots on. Her face was calm, her posture was loose. She didn't have the rigid, overcorrected stance of someone trying to prove something. That bothered him more than if she had. "You got any K9 experience?" he asked. "Some," she said. "Some?" He repeated the word like it tasted bad. "We don't do some here, sweetheart. These aren't pet dogs. These are combat-certified military working animals. We've had experienced handlers come through that door and walk out the same day." Lena nodded once. "Okay." Briggs stared at her. "Okay. That's all you've got." "You asked if I had experience. I said I did. I don't think I need to write you a biography." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Briggs picked up the phone. Chief Mason Cole arrived at the K9 operations building at 0712. He was a big man, 6'2", 210 pounds, with the kind of face that had been weathered by 12 years of deployments into places that didn't make the news. He commanded the entire K9 training program at Echo 7 with the same philosophy he'd applied to every unit he'd ever run: pressure builds soldiers. Pain builds warriors. Anything that couldn't survive the pressure wasn't worth saving. He read Lena's orders standing in the doorway. Then he read them again. "She came from where?" he said. Briggs shrugged. "Paper says Fort Campbell. Administrative transfer." Fort Campbell. Cole looked up at Lena. "You're admin." "No," Lena said. "I'm a handler. The transfer came through admin." "What unit?" "The orders have everything you need." Cole folded the papers slowly and tucked them under his arm. He walked toward her until he was close enough that most people would have stepped back. She didn't. "I'm going to ask you again," he said quietly. "What unit?" "The orders have everything you need, Chief." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger exactly. More like calculation. He was a man who had learned to read people the way other people read maps, quickly, efficiently, and always looking for the weak point. He scanned her face for the usual signs: nervousness, overcompensation, the desire to fill silence with explanation. He found none of them. "All right," he said finally, stepping back. "You want to work dogs, fine. I'll put you on the field in 1 hour. But I'll tell you right now, this program runs on standards, my standards. If you can't meet them, I don't care whose signature is on your paperwork. You're gone by noon. Lena looked at him steadily. I understand. Cole turned to Briggs. Put her through intake, and get the field ready. He paused at the door. Tell Martinez to bring Rex out. Briggs looked up sharply. Chief Rex is in behavioral restriction. He's not supposed to be on the evaluation field until... I said bring Rex out. Briggs didn't argue again. The 30 operators who gathered around the K-9 training field that morning hadn't been officially summoned. Word traveled the way it always did on bases like this, fast sideways, and without anyone taking formal responsibility for starting it. One man told another told 3 more. By 0800, every SEAL attached to the facility had found a reason to be somewhere near that field. They stood in loose groups along the perimeter, arms crossed, sunglasses on, body language communicating the same message in 30 slightly different dialects. This is going to be entertaining. Handler. First Class Danny Ortega stood slightly apart from the others, watching Lena gear up near the equipment cage. He was 29, with an easy face and dark eyes that were sharper than his relaxed expression suggested. He'd been at Echo 7 for 2 years. He'd seen a lot of people come through the evaluation field for the first time. He'd never seen anyone gear up the way she did. Most people, especially newcomers, put on every piece of protective equipment available before stepping near the K-9 compound. Bite sleeve, full arm guards, padded vest, helmet sometimes. It was psychological as much as physical. A wall of material between yourself and the animal. Lena Cross put on a standard bite sleeve for her left arm, just the sleeve, nothing else. Ortega uncrossed his arms. He watched her pull the sleeve on with practiced ease, flex her fingers once, and then stand quietly while she waited. One of the operators beside him, a broad-shouldered guy named Holt, let out a short laugh. She's either very confident or very stupid. Or very experienced, Ortega said. Holt snorted. At what? Because it's not this. Ortega didn't answer. He kept watching. Using. Rex came out of the kennel building like a storm that had been waiting for a door to open. He hit the length of his lead at full speed, all 95 pounds of muscle and fury, and the handler holding him. Martinez, a solid man who'd worked with combat dogs for 6 years, actually had to plant his feet and lean back against the pull. Rex was barking in rapid explosive bursts. Body-low hackles raised every line of his body, radiating the biological language of a predator locked onto a target. The field went quiet. Even the operators who had been lounging against the perimeter fence straightened up. Because Rex was not performing. He was not showing off. He was operating on something raw and real and unmediated by training commands. 3 handlers had already failed with him in the last 4 months. Not failed in the sense of a poor evaluation score. Failed in the sense of being taken off the field with injuries that required medical reports. Rex had been put in behavioral restriction twice. The second time, there had been serious discussion about whether he could be rehabilitated at all. And now, he was being brought out to face a woman who had been on base for less than 2 hours. Chief Cole stood with his hands behind his back near the edge of the field. His face was completely neutral. He gave nothing away. Martinez brought Rex to the entry point of the steel training cage and looked at Lena. His expression asked a question his mouth didn't. She answered it with a small nod. Martinez opened the gate. The first thing Lena did when the gate opened was nothing. She stood exactly where she was, weight-centered, hands at her sides, eyes on Rex, not in the hard, dominant way Cole's program taught, where you establish authority through eye contact and physical posture. Something different, something quieter. Rex exploded forward. The chain snapped taut at 15 feet, and he hit the end of it so hard the entire cage structure vibrated. He was barking in a register that wasn't warning, it was pure committed aggression, the sound a dog makes when it has already decided. 3 of the operators at the perimeter fence took an involuntary step back. Rex lunged again, and again. The chain held. His paws churned the dirt. His bark was continuous and devastating, and directed entirely at the woman 12 feet away who hadn't moved a single inch. Holt turned to the man beside him and said, "She's frozen. That's shock. She's locked up." Ortega shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "She's not frozen." Then Lena Cross opened her mouth and spoke, not loudly, not in the sharp, commanding bark that SEAL training protocol demanded from handlers. Quietly, calmly, in a language that nobody on the field recognized. Check. The command was 2 syllables, low and precise, and delivered without a shred of performance in it, like she'd said it 1,000 times before in places these operators had never been. Rex stopped. Not slowly. Not after a second of hesitation. Immediately. His body went rigid. The bark died mid-note. His head came up and his ears went forward, and he stood there, chest-heaving, muscles trembling, staring at her with an expression that in a human being would have been called disbelief. The field was absolutely silent. Cole's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lena took 3 slow steps forward. She stopped at the edge of Rex's reach. She crouched down, making herself smaller, bringing herself to his level, and she waited. Rex looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down. Nobody on that field said a single word. Holt broke the silence first, because Holt always did. "What in the—" He stopped himself. Started again. What language was that? Nobody answered him. Ortega was already walking toward the field edge, trying to get a better angle on what he was watching. Because what he was watching didn't make operational sense. Rex was a dog with documented behavioral flags going back 8 months. He'd been evaluated by 2 certified military working dog trainers who had both recommended controlled retirement. You didn't just walk into a cage with him and speak 2 quiet words and get that result, unless you knew something about that dog that the training reports didn't contain. Martinez, still holding the slack lead near the cage gate, looked like a man trying to decide if he was witnessing something normal or not. He wasn't. He'd worked with Rex longer than anyone on base. He knew what Rex's calm looked like. He knew what Rex's obedience looked like. He'd never seen Rex's trust before. He hadn't known it existed. Chief Cole watched all of it without moving. Then he said at normal volume to nobody in particular, "Martinez, close the gate." Martinez blinked. "Chief, she's still—" "Close it. Leave her in there." "Mig." The gate closed behind her with a heavy metallic sound. Inside the cage, Lena heard it and didn't look back. She kept her eyes on Rex, who was still sitting still watching her with that strange, arrested attention. His breathing had slowed. His hackles were down. He was still trembling slightly, but it wasn't aggression anymore. It was something that looked almost like effort, like a dog fighting through layers of conditioned response to find something underneath them that it had been told not to trust. She extended her right hand, palm down, low. Not toward his face, to the side, so he had to make the choice to move toward it. He didn't move. She waited. 15 seconds passed. Outside the cage, nobody breathed. Then Rex leaned forward, 1 slow inch at a time. His nose touched the back of her hand so lightly it was barely contact. He pulled back, did it again, and then he pushed his entire heavy head into her palm and held it there, and a sound came out of him. Not a bark, not a growl, something low and broken and exhausted that sounded like a dog who had been fighting for a very long time and had just been told he could stop. Holt said very quietly, "What the hell is she?" Ortega turned around and looked at Cole. Cole was standing completely still, and the expression on his face was no longer neutral. It was controlled, tightly, deliberately controlled, and that was different. Cole pulled her off of the field at 09:30. Not angry exactly, but with the specific energy of a man who has seen something he needs to understand before it becomes a problem. He led her into the operations office, closed the door, and turned around. "Where did you learn that command?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Which one?" Lena said. "Don't play games with me, Cross. I've been running K-9 programs for 12 years. I've seen handlers from 8 different countries. Nobody walks into a cage with Rex and gets that response in under 2 minutes. Not on their first day. Not ever. He stepped toward her. So you're going to tell me exactly where you trained, what program you came from, and what you know about that dog. Lena met his eyes without blinking. My orders are classified. I'm the training commander of this facility. I have clearance to... You don't have clearance for where I came from, Chief. She said it simply, not smugly, not as a threat, just as a fact, the way you'd tell someone the building is closed on Sundays. I'm here to assist with the K-9 program. That's what my orders say. That's what I'm going to do. Cole stared at her, a long stare with a lot happening behind it. Classified, he said. Yes. You're 26 years old. I'm aware. Another long pause. Then, fine. You want to assist with the program, fine. You'll assist under my direct supervision. Every session. Every evaluation. You do nothing, you change nothing, you go nowhere without my sign-off. Understood? Understood, Lena said. She started toward the door. Cross. She stopped. That dog will turn on you, Cole said. Whatever you did today, it won't last. Animals aren't loyal to strangers. They're reactive. You caught him in a moment, that's all. Lena turned halfway and looked at him over her shoulder. With respect, Chief, she said quietly. I don't think that's what we saw. She walked out. My case. The rest of that first day, Lena kept her head down and her eyes open. She was given a bunk in the temporary housing block, a base access badge with limitations she noticed but didn't comment on, and a copy of the current K-9 program training schedule. She read it twice in the first hour. By the time she ate dinner in the main mess hall, she had most of it memorized. Ortega found her at a corner table eating alone. He set his tray down across from her without asking. Sergeant First Class Danny Ortega, he said. I'm one of the senior handlers. I know who you are, Lena said. You've been running primary evaluation sessions with Rex for the last 6 weeks. Ortega paused halfway into sitting down. How do you know that? The training schedule has handler names. He settled into his seat and studied her. The schedule was printed 4 days ago. You just got here this morning. I read fast. He laughed short, genuine, and picked up his fork. They ate in silence for a minute. Then he said, What you did in that cage this morning, I've never seen anything like it. I've been working with Malinois a long time. How long? She looked up at him. He had an open face. Not a pushover, she could tell that immediately, but not performing either. He was genuinely curious. There was a difference, and she'd learned early how to tell it apart. Long enough, she said. Ortega nodded, accepting that. Can I ask you something else? You can ask. Rex, the way he responded to you. He set his fork down. He's not a bad dog. I want you to know that. Whatever the behavioral flags say, whatever Cole has told command, he's not a bad dog. He's a broken dog. Those are two different things. And I've been saying that for 4 months, and nobody's been listening. Lena looked at him for a moment. Then she said, What happened to him overseas? Ortega's expression shifted slightly, not closing down, more like bracing. What do you mean? Something happened, before his current behavioral pattern started. There's a deployment in his record that ends with a 48-hour gap in handler reporting. That's not normal. That kind of gap shows up when something goes in an incident report that someone doesn't want easily connected. She watched Ortega's face carefully. You know what it is. He was quiet for a long moment. Talk to Martinez, he said finally. Not here. Find him tomorrow morning before first formation. Then he picked his fork back up and returned to his food, and the way he did it told her he wasn't going to say anything else on that subject tonight. She found Martinez the next morning at 0550 outside the kennel building in the gray pre-dawn light. He was sitting on a concrete step, coffee in both hands, looking at the ground like it owed him an answer. He heard her footsteps and looked up. Whatever he expected from Ortega's message, she could see it wasn't her. You're the new girl, he said. Lena Cross. I know who you are. The whole base knows who you are." He looked at her for a moment. "What Ortega told me you wanted to talk about?" He stopped. Started again. "You understand that what I tell you I'm not putting in writing. I'm not testifying. I'm not going on record." "I understand," Lena said. She sat down on the step beside him without being invited. Martinez stared at his coffee cup. "We were in Kandahar province, 11 months ago. Me and Rex and a team running site clearance operations." He paused. "There was a building. Intel said it was clear. It wasn't." Another pause longer. "Rex found the threat. He did exactly what he was trained to do. Exactly right. Nothing wrong with his performance." His voice had gone flat, in the way voices go flat when someone is reporting something they've said to themselves 100 times in their own head and still haven't found the right shape for. "But the officer running the op had given us a timeline. We were behind. He told me to push Rex forward before the site was clear." Lena didn't say anything. "Rex took a concussive blast at close range," Martinez said. "Not a bite wound. Not a strike. Concussive. Neurological. The kind of thing that doesn't show up on a basic field health assessment because you're not looking for it, you're looking for blood." He finally looked at her. "I filed a report. I said he needed a full neurological evaluation before returning to active duty. Cole told me the report would delay our deployment metrics. He had it reclassified." The word landed between them, reclassified. "Rex came back from Kandahar a different dog," Martinez said. "More reactive, more unpredictable. And every time he showed stress responses, the kind that would have made sense if anyone had actually looked at the neurological injury, Cole put it in the training record as a behavioral problem. Aggression, disobedience, handler error." He shook his head slowly. 8 months of that. 8 months of being told you're a problem when you're actually just in pain. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nova." Martinez looked at her sharply. "The female K-9 in restricted housing," Lena said. "I saw her file on the training roster this morning. She's been in behavioral shutdown for 2 months. What happened to her?" Martinez set down his coffee cup. He looked at her the way someone looks at a door they're not sure they should open. "Same program," he said quietly. "Different mission, same outcome." He paused. "She's not aggressive. She's just gone. Stopped responding to commands. Stopped eating regularly. Just gone." He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment. "The vet cleared her physically. Cole wants her retired immediately. Says she's a liability." "She's not a liability," Lena said. "She's a trauma response case." Martinez looked at her. "You sound very sure for someone who hasn't met her yet." Lena stood up from the step. "When's the earliest I can get access to the restricted kennel?" "Cole has the access log. He controls who goes in." "I'm not asking Cole." She looked down at him steadily. "I'm asking you." Martinez was quiet for a long moment. The pre-dawn light was shifting now. Gray going to pale gold, and somewhere across the compound, a door banged, and boots started moving on concrete. First formation in 8 minutes. He reached into his jacket pocket and set a key card on the step beside him. He didn't look at her when he did it. He just picked up his coffee again and stared at the ground. Lena picked up the key card, tucked it into her sleeve, and walked toward the kennel building without another word. Nova was in the back corner of the restricted housing block, curled on a bare kennel floor, her head on her paws. She was a 3-year-old German Shepherd with a working weight of 68 pounds. Her coat was clean. The kennel staff at least kept them physically cared for. But her eyes when Lena came through the door were the worst thing. Not aggressive, not frightened, just absent. The lights behind them simply weren't on. Lena sat down cross-legged on the floor outside the kennel door. Not standing, not crouching, fully on the floor, back straight, hands in her lap. Nova didn't lift her head. Lena didn't try to make her. She sat there for 23 minutes, silent, still, not demanding, not pushing, just present. At minute 23, Nova's tail moved. One slow sweep across the kennel floor. Then it stopped. But it had moved. Lena closed her eyes for a moment. Then she stood up, let herself out of the restricted kennel block, and walked directly toward the operations office. Because she knew now exactly what this program had done. And she knew exactly what it was going to take to undo it. And she also knew that Chief Mason Cole was not going to let that happen without a fight. The rest of the week, Lena moved carefully. She attended every training session on the schedule. She stayed within her designated role. She did not challenge Cole's methods in the field in front of his operators or in any formal channel. She watched. She listened. She kept detailed mental notes of everything she saw. She saw a handler named Garrett use a shock collar at a setting 3 levels above protocol and log it as a standard correction. She saw a dog named Atlas hit a stress avoidance marker 6 times in a single session, while his handler reported full compliance. She saw Chief Cole watch both of these things happen and say nothing. By Thursday, Ortega pulled her aside after evening formation. "You're being quiet," he said. "Too quiet," Coles noticed. "Good," Lena said. "That's not good. He's starting to ask questions about your background. He put in a records request this morning." She looked at him steadily. "To who?" "I don't know, but he looked like a man who expects to find something useful." Ortega hesitated. "Whatever it is you came here to do, you might want to move faster." "I'm not here to blow anything up," Lena said. "I know that. I'm not sure Cole knows that." She was quiet for a moment, watching the evening light go flat and orange across the training field. "Ortega," she said, "how many dogs in this program right now have documented stress flags in their training records?" He thought about it. 6, maybe 7. How many of those flags were reported by handlers? He was quiet for a moment. 2, maybe 3. And the rest? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She looked at him. "That's what I'm here to fix." Ortega held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Then you're going to need more than quiet observation. And you're going to need someone in your corner who has standing in this unit." A beat passed. "Are you offering?" she said. He looked out at the field. "I'm saying," he said carefully, "that Rex responded to you. And in this unit that counts for something, even with Cole." He walked back toward the barracks. Lena stood at the edge of the field for a moment longer. Somewhere on the other side of the base, in a concrete building with a locked door, a German shepherd lay on a bare floor with her head on her paws and her eyes somewhere else entirely. And in a behavioral restriction kennel 200 yards away, a 95-pound Belgian Malinois stood at the front of his enclosure, waiting, like he already knew she was coming back. She went back to Rex every morning before anyone else was on the field. Not officially. Not on the training schedule. 5:15 a.m., before first light broke over the Arizona desert, before the duty sergeant finished his first cup of coffee, before Chief Cole's truck pulled into the operations parking lot. She went in through the side entrance, used the access she'd quietly negotiated with Martinez, and spent 40 minutes with a 95-pound dog that the rest of the base had collectively decided was a liability. By the 4th morning, Rex was meeting her at the kennel door. By the 6th, he was lying down beside her while she read through training documentation, his head resting on her knee like he'd done it 1,000 times before. Not performing, not complying, just present in the way dogs are present when they've decided someone is safe. Martinez watched from the doorway on that 6th morning and didn't say a word for a long time. Then he said, "I've been handling military working dogs for 9 years. Lena looked up from the folder in her lap. 9 years, he repeated. And I have never seen that dog put his head on someone's knee. He's exhausted, Lena said simply. He's been fighting everything around him for 8 months because nothing around him made sense. That's not aggression. That's survival. Martinez stepped into the kennel corridor and crouched down against the opposite wall. He watched Rex for a moment. Cole's records request came back yesterday, he said carefully. Lena's hand didn't stop moving. She kept turning the page in the folder. And he didn't get what he wanted. Whatever you came from the wall is solid. He hit clearance levels he didn't have. Martinez paused. That made him angrier than if he'd found something bad. I know. He called Briggs into his office for 40 minutes last night. I don't know what was said, but Briggs came out looking like he'd been squeezed through something small. He looked at her. Cole is building something. A case. A move something. I can feel it. Rex shifted his weight and pressed closer against Lena's leg. How many dogs are due for the certification evaluation at the end of the month? She asked. 8. 6 handlers and the 2 problem cases Rex and Nova. What happens to Rex and Nova if they don't pass certification? Martinez was quiet for a moment. The answer lived in that silence before he said it. Permanent retirement, which for a combat dog with behavioral flags means euthanasia, Lena said. The word sat between them like something solid. Cole has the authority to make that recommendation, Martinez said. Command rarely overrides him on animal welfare decisions. He frames it as safety, as liability management. He rubbed the back of his neck. He's been talking about Rex's retirement since January. Lena closed the folder. She looked at Rex for a moment, this dog who had been concussed in a building in Kandahar, and then told month after month that his responses to that trauma were character defects. She put her hand on the side of his head and felt his breathing slow. He's not going to retire Rex while I'm here, she said. Martinez looked at her. You're one handler attachment on a temporary transfer, Lena. Cole runs this program. I know exactly what Cole runs, she said. That's why I'm still here. So, she pushed into Nova's session that afternoon without permission. Cole had scheduled a final assessment for the German Shepherd, a clinical evaluation designed to confirm behavioral shutdown and support the retirement recommendation. The evaluator was a civilian contractor named Henley, a compact professional man who arrived with a clipboard and the specific detached efficiency of someone who had already written his conclusion before seeing the subject. Lena walked into the assessment room 4 minutes after it started. Cole turned from where he was standing against the wall. His expression was immediate and controlled. Cross. This is a closed evaluation. I'm aware. Then you can leave. She didn't. She looked at Henley, who had stopped what he was doing and was watching the exchange with the careful neutrality of a man who understood political geometry. How long has the assessment been running? She asked him directly. Henley glanced at Cole, then back at her. About 3 minutes. What protocol are you using? Cole's voice dropped to a lower register. Cross. I said leave. Chief Cole, I have documented concerns about this dog's case history that are directly relevant to any assessment outcome. Under DOD animal welfare guidelines, those concerns need to be on record before a retirement recommendation is finalized. She held his gaze. That's not a request. That's procedure. The room was very quiet. Henley set his clipboard down on the table beside him. She's right, he said. If there are procedural concerns, they need to be logged before I finalize anything. Cole looked at Henley for 2 full seconds with an expression that could have etched glass. Then he looked at Lena. You have 5 minutes, he said. And then you and I are going to have a very different conversation. Thank you, Chief, she said. She turned to Henley and said, Nova's behavioral shutdown began 9 weeks after she returned from overseas deployment. Her last mission has a 48-hour reporting gap in the handler records. Before we assess her current behavioral state, I need the complete deployment documentation, including the mission report from that gap period entered into her case file. Henley wrote that down. And if that documentation isn't available, then this assessment is incomplete. Cole said, That documentation is classified. Lena turned to look at him. Then the assessment needs to wait until it's declassified. A beat. Or you can request that it be made available to a welfare evaluation, which is a standard procedural option. She paused. I'd be happy to file that request today if it would help move things along. Cole's jaw was set so hard she could see the muscle working. He said nothing. Henley looked at his clipboard. "I'll note that the assessment is pending complete documentation," he said carefully. "That puts a hold on any retirement recommendation until the record is complete." Cole looked at Henley for a long moment. Then he walked out of the room. Lena exhaled once slowly. Nova, in the far corner of the room, had lifted her head for the first time in the assessment. She was looking at Lena. Wag. Cole came for her at 1700 in the corridor outside the operations office. He didn't yell. That was the thing about Cole. He never yelled. His anger ran at low temperature and high pressure, the kind that didn't make noise but could crack stone. He stopped her in the corridor, and he stood close, and he said very quietly, "You think you're protecting those dogs?" "I know I am," Lena said. "You're undermining a training program that has produced more certified combat K-9 teams than any other facility in the Southwest region. You've been here 8 days, and you're filing procedural holds on assessments and pulling handlers aside for unofficial conversations and running unauthorized early morning sessions with a restricted animal." He leaned in slightly. "You think I don't see all of it. I think you see exactly what you want to see," she said. "And I think what you're seeing right now is a threat to your numbers." Something moved behind his eyes. "My numbers. Deployment metrics, certification rates, the scores that keep this program funded and keep your command record clean." She held her ground completely. "Rex has a neurological injury from Kandahar that was never properly treated. Nova has a trauma response from a mission that has a classified reporting gap. Those aren't behavioral failures. Those are program failures, and you know it." Cole stared at her. For the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something in his face that wasn't calculation. It was something older and more complicated than that. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Martinez filed a field medical report in Kandahar," she said quietly. "He reported Rex's injury on the day it happened. That report doesn't appear in Rex's current file. The only person with administrative access to remove it is the program commander." She watched him. "That's you, Chief?" The corridor was absolutely silent. Cole said nothing. "I'm not here to destroy your program," Lena said. "I'm here because those dogs deserve what every soldier deserves, an honest accounting of what happened to them." She paused. "But if you keep blocking that, then I'm going to file my own documentation. And unlike Martinez's report, mine won't disappear." She walked past him. He didn't stop her, but she felt his eyes on her back all the way down the corridor, and she knew with the certainty of someone who had spent years learning to read the space between what people said and what they intended that the thing that had just happened between them was not a victory. It was a starting pistol. So, Ortega was waiting in the equipment room at the end of the corridor. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough," she said. "He's going to move. I just don't know how yet. Briggs has been pulling duty rosters all afternoon, looking at who Lena Cross has been talking to." He crossed his arms. "Martinez is going to be the first one he goes after." She stopped moving. "Can Martinez protect himself?" "Depends on what Cole can document. If he ties him to the unauthorized kennel access, the key card." Ortega shook his head. "Martinez is 6 months from retirement eligibility. Cole knows that. You threaten a man's pension, you change what he's willing to say." "Cole wouldn't do that," she said, and even as she said it, she heard the uncertainty in her own voice. Ortega heard it too. "Cole is a man who buried a field medical report to protect his certification numbers," he said. "He's already decided what the rules mean when they're inconvenient." He looked at her steadily. "What's your actual play here, not the procedural moves, your actual play?" She was quiet for a moment. In the silence, she could hear the K-9s in the distance, kennels, the normal sounds of the evening routine, feeding time, the sounds of animals that had no knowledge of what was being decided about them in a corridor 40 yards away. "The deployment footage," she said. Ortega went very still. "Nova's mission," she said. "The gap in the records. Somewhere there's footage from that deployment. Helmet cam base security something. If I can access what actually happened to her overseas, I have grounds for a formal welfare investigation that Cole can't block with paperwork." She looked at Ortega. "Do you know who was on that mission?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I was," he said. She stared at him. His jaw was tight. His eyes were somewhere else entirely for a moment, somewhere 11 months back and several thousand miles away. Then he came back. "I was the secondary handler on that mission. Nova belonged to a handler named Reese. Reese was medevaced out with a shoulder injury on day 2. I ran her for the last 18 hours of the operation." "Ortega. She found an IED cache in a compound we'd cleared twice," he said. His voice was controlled flat, the way Martinez's had been, the report voice, the voice that separated you from the thing you were describing. "She marked it correctly, by the book, but the OP commander ordered us to move past the cache and continue the sweep. He said the EOD team would handle it on the follow-through. We kept moving." He stopped, started again. "The EOD team never came. The follow-through order got lost somewhere in the command chain. We circled back 6 hours later and Nova went in ahead of us because that was protocol." He stopped completely. Lena waited. "She was 5 feet from the cache when something shifted," he said. "We don't know if it was a pressure plate or a tripwire or something in the compound structure. It didn't detonate, but she flushed back in full panic. Not trained retreat panic, and she covered 18 meters in about 4 seconds and hit the compound wall." He exhaled. "Concussion. Soft tissue damage in her left shoulder. Reese was already out, so I wrote the field report. I put everything in it. What she found, what the commander ordered, why the EOD follow-through failed, what happened when she came back through." He looked at Lena. "When we got back to base, my report had 2 pages missing." The silence was complete. "Who had access to your report?" she said. Ortega looked at her steadily. "The mission fell under Echo 7's operational oversight. Cole reviewed all field documentation from that deployment." A pause. "He told me later that the missing pages must have been a transmission error." Lena said quietly, "Did you believe him?" "No," Ortega said. "I just didn't know what to do about it." She held his gaze. "Now you do." Kate. That night, lying on her bunk in the temporary housing block at 2200 hours, Lena stared at the ceiling and assembled everything she had. A buried field medical report. A German Shepherd with a trauma response that the program commander was trying to shut down permanently. Ortega's mission report with 2 pages missing. And underneath all of it, the larger structure, a training program that had been prioritizing deployment certification rates over the actual psychological health of the animals it was fielding. Not out of cruelty exactly, out of the particular institutional blindness that came from measuring the wrong things for long enough that the measuring became the mission. She thought about Rex pressing his head into her hand on the first morning, the weight of it, the exhaustion in it. She thought about Nova lying on a bare concrete floor with her eyes somewhere else. She turned on her side and looked at the wall. She had 11 days before the certification evaluation. 11 days in which Cole was going to escalate, she was certain of that now, and in which she needed to build a case that didn't depend on Martinez's keycard access, or Ortega's off-the-record testimony, or her own classified background that she still couldn't talk about. She needed the footage. She closed her eyes. And in the morning, she got up at 4:55 and went back to Rex. What she didn't know, what nobody told her until 2 days later, was that Cole had moved the night she confronted him in the corridor. He'd submitted a formal request to have her transfer orders reviewed on the grounds of operational incompatibility. He'd also contacted someone at Fort Campbell, not through official channels, but through a back-channel military contact that existed in every senior commander's network, the informal system of favors and relationships that ran parallel to the formal command structure and sometimes carried more weight. He was looking for something to use. He didn't find her training record because her training record was behind a wall he couldn't get over. But he found something else. He found a name. The name belonged to a program called Project Sentinel, a classified joint military and federal research initiative that had run for 4 years before being quietly shut down. Cole had never heard of it. Most people in his clearance range had never heard of it. But the edge of it was visible if you knew what combination of records to pull, and Cole had spent 36 years learning which records talked to each other when you applied the right pressure. Project Sentinel had trained K-9 handlers, using methods that were, to put it in the formal language of the decommissioning report, that Cole managed to access significantly outside conventional protocol. Specifically, it had trained handlers to work with military dogs that had been identified as psychologically unsuitable for standard programs. Traumatized animals. Animals with behavioral shutdowns, aggression flags, handler bonding failures. The program had taken those dogs, and instead of retiring them, it had rehabilitated them into functional deployment assets. The decommissioning report said the program had been shut down due to resource reallocation. Cole read that phrase 3 times. Then he made a phone call. The person he called was a colonel named Waverly, who sat on the joint K-9 Operational Oversight Board that controlled certification standards across 14 military facilities, including Echo 7. Cole was on the phone for 22 minutes. When he hung up, he went to his desk and started writing a formal performance evaluation for Lena Cross. The evaluation was dated the current day. It cited repeated violations of operational protocol, unauthorized access to restricted animals, and behavior detrimental to program cohesion. It recommended immediate reassignment pending review. It was the kind of document that, once filed, would trigger an automatic freeze on her access credentials within 48 hours. He signed it and put it in an envelope. Ortega found out about the evaluation from Briggs. Not because Briggs told him, but because Briggs had a habit of leaving documents face up on his desk when he went to get coffee, and Ortega had a habit of reading things that were left face up on desks. He went directly to Lena. She was in the middle of a session with Rex on the back training field, running quiet obedience work. Nothing dramatic, nothing that looked like what it actually was, which was systematic trust rebuilding. Rex was moving through a simple pattern of commands, responding with a precision that 4 months ago would have seemed impossible. Ortega stood at the field edge and waited. She saw him and read his face, and finished the command sequence and gave Rex his release word. She walked over. He filed a performance evaluation, Ortega said without preamble. I saw it on Briggs's desk. It's bad enough to trigger a credential freeze. She absorbed that. When does it go in? I don't know. Could be tomorrow morning. Could be tonight if he has someone walk it through after hours. She looked back at Rex, who was sitting at the field edge, watching her with the focused, patient attention she'd spent 2 weeks earning. Does Briggs know you saw it? No. Keep it that way. She was thinking fast. She could see it in the slight tension around her eyes, the way her jaw set. The footage from Nova's deployment. Ortega, you said there was helmet cam. Where does that footage go after a mission? Base Intelligence Archive. But is it on the same system as the K-9 training documentation? He paused. Adjacent system. Same server architecture, different access tiers. She turned and looked at him directly. Who on this base has cross-tier access? Ortega was quiet for a moment. Then, the base intelligence officer, Lieutenant Carver. Do you know him, May? I know his K-9, Ortega said slowly. German Shepherd named Duke. I ran Duke's initial certification 2 years ago. He looked at her. Carver's been trying to recertify Duke for months. Cole keeps finding reasons to delay it. Duke is Carver's first working dog he's attached in the way handlers get attached. The delays have been frustrating him. The silence between them was exactly 3 seconds long. Introduce me to Lieutenant Carver, Lena said. She met Carver the following morning at 0800 in the motor pool, which Ortega had arranged with the careful indirection of someone who had been navigating institutional politics for long enough to know that a direct ask was the least effective move. Carver was 32 years old with an officer's precision in his posture and the slightly frayed look of someone who had been butting against an obstacle long enough that it was starting to wear on him. He watched Lena approach with Duke beside him, a 4-year-old shepherd who moved with the restrained energy of a well-trained dog who wasn't working enough. Ortega says you want to talk about Duke, Carver said. I do, Lena said. And I want to talk about why his recertification keeps getting delayed. Carver looked at her with a careful measuring expression. That's a program administration question. Duke has clean behavioral scores across every assessment he's had in the last 18 months. He has a solid handler bond, consistent obedience ratings, and no documented health flags. She watched him. There's no legitimate reason his recertification is on hold, which means the reason isn't legitimate. Carver said nothing. But his hand moved to Duke's head, the automatic, unthinking gesture of a handler whose connection to his dog was real in the way that mattered more than any certification document. I can help with Duke, Lena said. I have methods that can address whatever Cole is flagging as the reason, and they work quickly. She paused. But I need something from you first. Carver looked at her steadily. What? I need access to the helmet cam archive from a K-9 deployment 11 months ago. Operation designation is in the handler records under Nova's case file. The mission with the 48-hour reporting gap. The silence stretched. That archive is intelligence tier, Carver said. What you're describing is not a simple records request. I know exactly what it is, she said. And I know you have the access level to pull it under a welfare documentation review. It's a procedural option, not a breach. Carver looked at Duke, looked at Lena. Then he said very carefully, if I pull that archive and what's in it is what you seem to think it is, then 2 dogs get a fair accounting, she said. And so does your man Duke. Another silence. Longer this time. Duke pushed his head up against Carver's hand. I'll need 24 hours, Carver said. You have 18, she said. After that, Cole's performance evaluation on me goes through and my access is frozen. Carver stared at her. How do you know about 18 hours, she said. And she walked away. Cole found her at 1400 on the main training field. She saw him coming from 40 yards out, and she had time to take one slow breath and set her feet before he reached her. You went to Carver, he said. I've spoken to several people on base, she said. You went to the intelligence officer and requested archive access that you don't have clearance for. He was doing the low-temperature thing again, controlled, compressed his voice barely above normal conversation level. That's not a procedural move, Cross. That's a provocation. I filed a welfare documentation request, she said. That's exactly what it is. Carver doesn't have authorization to pull operational archives on a handler's informal request. He's the base intelligence officer. He has authorization that neither of us has. She looked at him steadily. And if the footage from that operation shows what I believe it shows, what Martinez's report showed, and what Ortega's mission report showed before those pages disappeared, then the retirement recommendations you've filed on Rex and Nova are based on fraudulent behavioral documentation. Cole's eyes were completely still. Be very careful, he said. You are a temporary transfer with a classified background that nobody can verify, and a record of violating program protocol since your first day on this base. You are standing on very thin ground. Then let's see what the footage shows, she said. If I'm wrong, your ground gets thicker and mine disappears. That's a good deal for you. A beat. Unless I'm not wrong. The moment between them stretched, and in that moment, for just a fraction of a second, she saw it. The thing she'd been watching for since the first day in his corridor. Behind the controlled expression, behind the calculation, behind 12 years of command authority and institutional armor, fear. Not of her. Not of losing his position. Fear of what those dogs had been through while he looked the other way. It was there, and then it was gone, replaced immediately by the mask, by the performance of authority, by the version of himself that had made every accommodation possible seem justified. But she'd seen it. And that changed everything she knew about what she was actually dealing with. He walked away without another word. She stood on the field and watched him go. Rex was at the far end of the training lane waiting for her. She went back to him. She sat down in the dirt. and Rex came to her immediately. No hesitation, no holding back, and pressed himself against her side, with the full weight of a 95-pound dog who had decided in the particular absolute way that dogs decide things that this person was the reason to keep trying. She put her arm around him and said nothing. 18 hours. The footage either existed, and Carver could get it, or it didn't, and everything she'd built in the last 2 weeks would collapse under Cole's performance evaluation before she could file a single formal complaint. Rex breathed slowly beside her. She thought about Nova on her kennel floor, about the mission document with the missing pages, about the way Cole's eyes had shifted for that one fraction of a second. She thought about what it cost a person to do what Cole had done not once as a clear decision, but slowly, year after year, accommodation after accommodation, until the thing you were protecting was no longer the program, or even the mission, but just the version of yourself that could live with all of it. And she thought, that's the thing about buried truth. It doesn't stay buried, it waits. Carver came to her in 16 hours and 40 minutes, not at the kennel, not at the operations building. He found her at the back of the motor pool, in the narrow gap between 2 maintenance vehicles, where the base security cameras had a blind spot. She hadn't told him about the blind spot, which meant he'd found it himself. That told her something important about how seriously he was taking this. He handed her a tablet. He didn't say anything. He just handed it to her, and the look on his face said everything his mouth wasn't going to. The footage was 43 minutes long. It was helmet cam slightly tilted the way helmet cam always was, the frame jolting with movement and going flat during the pauses. The timestamp in the corner read 11 months ago. The location tag read Kandahar Province. And for the first 22 minutes, it was exactly what any overseas K-9 operation looked like. Compound entry systematic sweep, the controlled tension of real fieldwork, where the dog was the point of the spear, and the handlers moved according to her signals. Nova moved beautifully in those first 22 minutes. That was the thing that hit hardest. She moved with the specific fluid confidence of a dog who knew exactly what she was doing and trusted completely that the people around her were paying attention. She marked the IED cache at the 18-minute mark, clear, unambiguous by the book. Sat. Stared at the handler. Waited. And then a voice on the recording, clipped authoritative carrying the particular tone of someone who did not want to be questioned, said, "Move past it. EOD handles it on follow-through. We keep going." Lena watched Nova look at the handler. Watched the handler look at Nova. Watched the moment pass where the handler could have pushed back and didn't. They moved past the cache. She watched the next 20 minutes with her jaw tight and her hand completely still on the edge of the tablet. When Nova came back through 6 hours later and hit the pressure plate that hadn't been cleared, the camera caught everything, the sound, the movement, the dog's body flushing backward in full panic, the impact with the compound wall, and then Nova. Down, not moving, the way a dog moves when it's dead, but moving the way a dog moves when the world has just done something to it that nothing in its training had prepared it for. And then the footage cut. Not faded. Not ended naturally. Cut. Hard. Mid-frame. Lena looked up from the tablet. Carver said, "That's where the archive file ends. There's a gap of 41 seconds before the next file begins." 41 seconds, she said. "I pulled the server metadata. The gap is real. It's not a transmission error. It's not a recording failure. Someone accessed that archive file from an administrative terminal and removed 41 seconds of footage." He paused. "The access log shows the administrative terminal ID, but not the user credential, because whoever did it used a ghost login. A ghost login requires senior-level technical access and deliberate knowledge of the base server architecture." Lena was quiet for a moment. "Does Cole have that level of technical access?" "Not directly," Carver said. "But Colonel Waverly's office does, and Cole called Waverly 3 days ago. I checked the base communications log." He looked at her steadily. "Waverly sits on the Joint K-9 Operational Oversight Board. He has full administrative access to K-9-related documentation across every facility under that board's jurisdiction, including ours. The full shape of it, landed in her chest like something physical. Cole hadn't just buried Martinez's field medical report and had Ortega's mission pages removed. He'd gone to the oversight board, the body that was supposed to be the check on program commanders like him, and the oversight board had helped him. "This goes higher than Cole," she said. "Yes," Carver said. She handed the tablet back to him. "Can you copy the footage and the server metadata to a secure record time-stamped, not on the base system?" "Already done," Carver said. "I sent a duplicate to an attorney I know at JAG, addressed it as a procedural inquiry with attached supporting documentation." He held her gaze. "I did that before I came to you, because if Cole's performance evaluation on you goes through in the next few hours, I needed that material somewhere he can't reach it." She stared at him. "You moved first." "I have a dog," he said simply, "who's been waiting 14 months for a certification that keeps getting blocked. I've been telling myself it was administrative backlog. Watching that footage, I'm done telling myself that." She nodded once, slow and definite. "Then we move today," she said, "before Cole finds out you pulled the archive." She went to Ortega next. She found him running a standard obedience session with his assigned K9, and she stood at the field edge and waited 3 minutes until he brought the dog in. He took one look at her face and said, "You got it." "I got it, and it's worse than we thought." She told him about the footage, about the cut, about the ghost login, about Waverly. Ortega stood completely still through all of it. The kind of stillness that happened when someone's body decided it needed to be very controlled because the information coming in was large enough to require it. When she finished, he said, "Waverly." "Waverly. He's been on the oversight board for 6 years," Ortega said. "He controls certification standards for 14 facilities. If he's been running interference for Cole..." He stopped, started again. "That's not one program. That's a systemic policy decision. That's dogs at every one of those 14 facilities potentially being managed the same way." "I know. Lena." He turned and looked at her directly. "This isn't a welfare complaint anymore. This is a federal investigation. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need from me?" "Your testimony," she said. "On record. The mission report, the missing pages, what you saw happen to Nova and Kandahar. I need you to say it in writing and put your name on it." The silence that followed was honest. She gave him that. She didn't push into it or fill it. He had a career. He had a unit. He had the specific vulnerability of someone who had seen something wrong and said nothing for 11 months and was now being asked to say something loudly officially and in a direction that pointed at people with significantly more institutional power than him. "Okay," he said. One word, clean and final. "Okay," she said back. "Nie." Cole found out about the archive pull at 1300. She didn't know how base networks had their own circulatory systems, their own ways of moving information through unofficial channels. But she was in the kennel with Rex when she heard his voice in the operations building 40 yards away, at a volume that was for Cole, the equivalent of shouting. She couldn't make out the words, but she didn't need to. She gave Rex his release command, stood up, and walked toward the sound. Briggs was in the operations doorway, looking like a man who wanted to be somewhere else. Cole was on the phone. His back was to the door. His posture told the whole story rigid forward, leaning the physical architecture of someone who was applying pressure through a telephone line. She caught fragments. "Not authorized. And I want it logged as a procedural breach," and then more quietly something that included Waverly's name and the words, "before it goes anywhere else." He turned and saw her standing in the doorway. He hung up. The look on his face was not anger. It was something that had moved past anger into a colder, more deliberate territory. "You want to tell me," he said, "what you think you've accomplished." "I think I've documented a welfare violation," she said. "I think I've established that 2 military working dogs sustained documented injuries in the field that were subsequently concealed in program records." And I think I've identified the administrative mechanism by which that concealment occurred. Cole walked toward her until he was 6 feet away. You are a temporary transfer with a classified background operating outside your designated role who has spent 3 weeks systematically compromising this program's personnel and documentation. You have nothing that will survive formal review. Carver filed the documentation with JAG this morning, she said. It's already in the formal review system. Something shifted in Cole's face, fast and then controlled again. But she caught it. Carver doesn't have the authority. He's the base intelligence officer. He has authority over archive access and welfare documentation procedure. You can argue jurisdiction with JAG. She held his gaze. But while you're arguing, the footage is on record. The metadata is on record. Martinez's original field report, which I had him reconstruct from his personal notes last night and sign and date, is on record. She paused. And Ortega's written testimony goes in this afternoon. The silence in the room was the kind that had weight. Cole said very quietly, "You came here to do this." "I came here because Rex and Nova deserve someone who would. This program has deployed 38 certified K-9 teams in the last 4 years," he said. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she heard something in his voice that wasn't control, something rougher. 38 teams, missions that saved lives, operations that couldn't have been run without those animals. His jaw worked for a moment. "I built that. I built every piece of it." "I know you did," she said. "Then you know what it costs. You know what you have to be willing to do, and willing to ignore to maintain operational capacity in a program that is perpetually underfunded and underevaluated and treated like a footnote by command, until the moment one of these dogs finds something that saves an entire team's lives." His voice had dropped to something almost conversational. "You come in here with your classified background and your check commands and your theory about trauma responses, and you make it sound very simple. Trust the dogs. Treat the dogs right. But you haven't sat in front of a board trying to justify your program's existence with a dog that's burned out, and a handler that's rotating out, and a certification test in 3 weeks and zero margin for. Chief Cole?" Her voice was steady, quiet, not cutting him off so much as anchoring him. "I have. I've sat in exactly that room. I know exactly what the pressure looks like from inside it." She paused. "And I know that it doesn't justify what happened to Rex in Kandahar. It doesn't justify what happened to Nova. Pressure is not permission." He looked at her for a long moment. Then Briggs appeared in the doorway behind her and said, "Chief, Colonel Waverly is on the line." Cole looked at Lena for one more second. Then he walked to the phone. She walked out. "McKeck." The call from Waverly lasted 19 minutes. She knew this because Ortega timed it from the corridor, standing close enough to the operations office door to hear the rhythm of Cole's voice without making out the content. When Cole came out at 14:20, he went directly to his vehicle and drove off base without speaking to anyone. Ortega found her in the restricted kennel with Nova. She'd made progress with Nova in the last week, slow, incremental, the kind of progress that didn't look like much from the outside, but meant everything if you understood what you were measuring. Nova was eating regularly now. She was responding to her name. She hadn't returned to active engagement yet, but the absence in her eyes was less complete, the lights coming back on slowly, in the way lights come back on in a building after a long outage room, by room uncertain, then steadier. Ortega crouched down at the kennel door. "Cole left the base." "Where did he go?" "Nobody knows. Briggs says he didn't log a destination." He paused. "Waverly is flying in tomorrow morning." Lena looked up from Nova. "Here to this base." That's what the scheduling office logged 30 minutes ago. Unannounced inspection visit. Ortega's voice had a careful flatness that told her he was thinking through implications at the same time he was speaking. An oversight board member flying in the morning after a JAG documentation filing is either someone coming to investigate or someone coming to contain. "Which do you think?" she said. He was honest. "I don't know. I've never seen Waverly move this fast on anything." She thought about it. Waverly helping Cole ghost log the archive deletion. Waverly on the oversight board for 6 years. Waverly as the system that was supposed to prevent exactly what had happened at Echo 7, instead facilitating it. "If he's coming to contain," she said, "he'll move on Carver first. Pull the JAG filing on jurisdictional grounds. Then he'll move on you and Martinez." "And you," Ortega said. "Me last," she said. "I'm the one with the classified background he can't access. I'm harder to discredit publicly." She paused. "Which means you and Martinez and Carver need to be bulletproof before tomorrow morning." Ortega looked at her. "How bulletproof are we talking?" "Signed, witnessed, time-stamped statements. All three of you. Tonight." She stood up. "And I need to make a phone call." The phone call went to a number she hadn't dialed in 14 months. She made it from outside the base perimeter, standing in the open air, where there was no chance of the base communication system logging the connection. The phone rang 3 times. 4. She was about to give up when the line connected and a voice said cross. "Colonel Hargrove," she said. A pause. "I wondered when you'd call." "Did you know about Waverly?" Another pause longer. "I knew about the pattern. I didn't know Waverly was the specific mechanism until your Carver filing hit the JAG system this morning." His voice was careful and measured the voice of a man who operated several moves ahead of the current moment at all times. "He's moving to contain. He'll be at Echo 7 by 0700. "I know," she said. "I need backup in the system before he gets here, something he can't override with Oversight Board authority." "What do you have?" "Footage with metadata showing a ghost-deleted segment. Martinez's reconstructed field report. Ortega's written testimony. Carver's archive access documentation." She paused. "And 2 dogs who are living evidence of exactly what the records were altered to conceal." She heard him exhale slowly. "You built that in 3 weeks." "I had help." "The people who helped you are going to face significant institutional pressure starting tomorrow morning." "I know that, which is why I need whatever you can put in place tonight." A longer silence. She could hear him thinking, or rather, she could hear the quality of the silence that meant he was thinking, which she'd learned to recognize over 4 years of working under his command, in a program that the rest of the military didn't officially know existed. "I can get an NCIS welfare investigation flagged through a back channel that Waverly doesn't have authority to block," he said. "It'll be preliminary, which means it creates a procedural freeze on any personnel actions against your witnesses. It won't be fast, and it won't be loud, but it will be there." "That's enough," she said. "For tonight, that's enough. Cross." His voice shifted slightly. "What you're doing at that base, the work with those dogs, that's why Sentinel existed. You know that." She was quiet for a moment. "I know." "Be careful tomorrow," he said. "Waverly didn't get where he is by losing quietly." The line went dead. She stood outside for a moment in the dark desert air, looking at the lights of the base. Somewhere inside, Rex was in his kennel. Nova was in hers. Martinez was at his bunk, writing a statement he was going to sign with his name and his 6 months away retirement on the line. Ortega was doing the same thing. Carver had already moved. She went back inside. Waverly arrived at 0650 the next morning, 10 minutes ahead of schedule. He was a tall man, late 50s, with silver-gray hair and the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most senior person in every room he entered. He came with a single aide, no announcement, and moved through the base with the efficiency of someone who already knew the layout. Cole was waiting for him at the operations building. Lena watched from across the compound. She didn't go to them. She went to the K9 field because she had a session scheduled and she was going to run it, and the most dangerous thing she could do right now was look like someone who was watching and waiting. Ortega appeared beside her at 0715. "Waverly pulled Carver into a meeting 15 minutes ago," he said quietly, not looking at her, his eyes on the dog in front of him as though he was assessing form. "What kind of meeting?" "Closed door. Briggs's office." He paused. "Briggs isn't in it. It's just Waverly and his aide and Carver. She kept her hand moving along Rex's flank. Steady pressure, the signal she'd taught him, meant everything is okay. Stay calm. Rex leaned slightly into her hand. Carver knows what he filed, she said. He knows it's protected by the JAG timestamp. Waverly can challenge jurisdiction, but he can't void it unilaterally. Knowing that and sitting across from a colonel on an oversight board are two different experiences, Ortega said. She knew that was true. 22 minutes later, Carver walked out of Briggs' office with his aide and crossed the compound toward the K-9 field. He reached her at 0740. She looked at his face. He offered to make Duke's certification problem disappear, Carver said. His voice was completely flat. Today, all delays resolved, full certification. He framed it as a goodwill gesture in the context of a procedural review. The silence stretched. "What did you say?" she asked. Carver looked at her steadily. "I told him the JAG filing stood, and that my documentation was complete and accurate, and that I would be happy to speak with any investigative authority about its contents." A pause. "Then I thanked him for his interest in Duke's certification and said I looked forward to the formal process resolving it appropriately." She let out a slow breath. "Carver, I have a dog," he said for the second time. "A dog who found an IED cache in a building that nobody else could clear. A dog who does his job every single time perfectly and has been waiting a year and a half for someone to say so officially." His jaw was tight. "I'm not trading that for a signature on a form that comes from a man who ghost-deleted 41 seconds of footage." Rex pushed his head against Lena's knee. She put her hand on him and held it there. Waverly found her at 0900. He came to the K-9 field. Cole was not with him. That was deliberate. She understood immediately that Waverly had assessed the situation and decided that Cole was a liability in a direct conversation with her, which told her something important about how Waverly was thinking. He stopped at the field edge. She brought Rex in and clipped his lead and stood with him at her side. "Ms. Cross," Waverly said. He had a voice that matched his bearing, smooth and calibrated. "I'd like to speak with you privately." "We can speak here," she said. He looked at Rex. Something passed across his face, not discomfort exactly, but a kind of recalibration. "Your documentation filing has created a significant procedural situation for this program. I filed accurate documentation of a welfare violation," she said. "The situation it created is the appropriate consequence of the violation, not of the filing." "There are nuances here that your documentation doesn't capture," he said. "Program commanders operate under resource constraints and operational pressures that welfare guidelines don't account for. Adaptation to those pressures isn't the same thing as misconduct." She looked at him. "A field medical report was removed from an animal's case file. 41 seconds of helmet cam footage was deleted from an operational archive using a ghost login. Those aren't adaptations to resource constraints. Those are deliberate acts to conceal information." She paused. "You know which terminal was used for the ghost login, Colonel, and so does JAG." Waverly was quiet for a moment. She watched him do what competent people did when they ran the calculation and found the answer wasn't what they wanted. He didn't panic. He adjusted. "What outcome are you looking for?" he said. And there it was. The negotiation. The pivot from pressure to transaction. She said, "A full NCIS welfare investigation of K-9 program management at this facility and any other facility under your board's oversight jurisdiction. Complete restoration of all altered documentation. Full veterinary and neurological evaluation of Rex and Nova by independent military veterinary specialists. And a formal review of program certification standards that includes animal psychological welfare metrics alongside deployment performance metrics." Waverly looked at her for a long moment. "That's a significant list. Those dogs went to Kandahar," she said quietly. "They did exactly what they were trained to do in exactly the conditions they were trained for exactly the mission they were certified to serve. And when the human beings around them made decisions that hurt them, the record was changed, so nobody would have to answer for it." She held his gaze. That's not a nuance, Colonel. That's a betrayal. And the list I gave you is what accountability looks like when a betrayal is documented. Rex sat perfectly still beside her, his shoulder warm against her leg. Waverly looked at the dog. A long time passed. Then he said, "I'll need to consult with my board." He walked away. She watched him go. She didn't move for a moment after he turned the corner. Then Ortega materialized from somewhere behind her. She hadn't known he was there, which meant he'd been careful, and said, "Did he fold?" "Not yet," she said, "but he's running the math." She bent down and checked Rex's lead clip more to give her hands something to do than because it needed checking. The NCIS flag that went in last night, did Hargrove confirm it? Martinez got a notification at 0600 from a JAG case number he didn't recognize. Ortega said carefully. The case classification matched a preliminary welfare investigation. She nodded. Then Waverly's math is already settled. He just doesn't know that we know that. She straightened up. And then from across the compound, sharp, sudden cutting through the morning air like a blade, an alarm went off. Not a drill alarm. Not the measured patterned sound of a scheduled exercise. The real alarm. The compound emergency system. A second later, a voice on the base. P. A. Briggs's voice, tight and fast. All personnel, live fire simulation, malfunction, building. 7 structural compromise. All personnel, clear the area. K9 handlers to emergency protocol. Rex was on his feet before the words finished. So was Lena. Ortega said, "That's the urban warfare simulation building. There's an operator team in there running a certification run." She was already moving. "Lena," Ortega started. "Get medical," she said without looking back. "Now." Rex moved beside her, reading her body language the way he read everything completely instantly, with the specific intelligence of an animal who had been trained to follow human direction and had chosen on top of that training to follow this particular human with something that ran deeper than obedience. She ran. And Rex ran with her. Neither of them hesitated for a single second. The building was still standing when she got there. That was the first thing, it was still standing, which meant there was still time, which meant she needed to think faster than the chaos happening around her, because chaos had a way of making people forget that. Building 7 was the Urban Warfare Simulation Complex, a 2-story concrete structure built to replicate the internal architecture of hostile structures encountered in overseas operations. Heavy walls, narrow corridors, deliberately compromised structural elements designed to simulate real-world deterioration. The kind of building that was safe when the simulated charges inside were controlled and extremely unsafe when they weren't. 3 operators were inside running a timed certification sequence when the malfunction hit. She knew that because Ortega had shouted it at her back as she ran, and because 2 members of their team were already outside the building perimeter looking at the entrance with the particular helpless intensity of people who understood exactly what was wrong and couldn't fix it from where they were standing. One of them, a big operator named Holt. The same man who had laughed at her on the first day was on a radio saying something clipped and technical that she caught the edge of as she reached the perimeter. Load-bearing column on the east side, compromised the primary entry, is blocked with debris. We've got 1 man down inside, and the other 2 can't get to him without... He looked up and saw her. He looked at Rex. His expression did something complicated in the space of about half a second. "How far in?" she said. "Second corridor junction. Left turn off the main hall. Maybe 40 feet from the entry." He paused. The column came down across the corridor. He's on the other side of it. We can hear him, but we can't see him, and the rubble configuration is if anyone tries to move it wrong, the ceiling section above it goes. She looked at the building entrance. She looked at Rex. Rex was already reading her. His body was forward-weighted attention, locked every muscle in him, saying the same word, ready. Holt said, "You're not wait. You're not seriously thinking." "What's the operator's name?" she said. A beat. "Garrett." She looked at Rex. She unclipped his lead. Holt grabbed her arm. Not hard, not restraining, just the reflex of someone watching something they didn't fully understand. That dog has a behavioral flag. If he goes in there and something goes wrong, she turned and looked at Holt directly. Garrett is 40 feet in. The ceiling is unstable. Rex's body weight is under 100 pounds, and his profile is low enough to navigate debris that a person can't. He can find Garrett and give us a locator signal in 90 seconds. She held his gaze. You want to keep having this conversation, or do you want Garrett out? Holt let go of her arm. She turned to Rex. She gave the command in Czech. 2 syllables. The same register she'd used on that first morning in the cage when 30 SEALs held their breath. Rex's ears went forward. His body went into the specific configuration she'd taught him. Low alert calculated the posture of a dog who understood that the environment ahead required a different kind of attention than a training field. She said his name once. He went in. Boy, the 40 seconds that followed were the longest of her professional life. She stood at the building entry and she listened, not to the radio traffic, not to Holt on the line with the base commander, not to the second operator who was saying something about ceiling load tolerance. She listened for Rex. The specific sounds of his movement, the pattern of his paws on concrete, the shift in sound quality that meant he'd turned a corner. She heard him reach the debris point at around the 20-second mark. A pause. Movement sounds changed slower, more deliberate, the sound of an animal navigating an obstacle with its body at a calculated angle. At 38 seconds, she heard it. 1 sharp bark, 2 short ones. Locator signal. She exhaled. Holt turned to look at her. What does that mean? It means he found him. And Garrett is conscious enough to respond to the approach, or Rex would have given a different signal. She was already reading the entry configuration, already mapping what she knew about the building layout against what Holt had described. Can your 2 men outside create a stabilization brace on the east column section? Enough to buy 60 seconds of safe entry. Holt was on the radio before she finished the sentence. The 2 operators outside moved. She went in. The corridor was dark and thick with concrete dust. She moved fast, low, one hand on the wall for orientation. The debris field started about 20 feet in pieces of ceiling material, a section of something that had been a partition wall, and at the junction, the collapsed column section lying at a diagonal across the corridor in a way that made the ceiling above it groan with every distant vibration. Rex was on the other side of it. She could hear him moving. He was doing the thing she'd trained him for, the thing she'd spent 4 years refining with animals that everyone else had written off, which was staying with the person he'd found and keeping them calm through proximity and sound. He wasn't barking. He was making a low, steady vocalization, keeping Garrett company in the dark. She got to the column section and looked at the gap, 14 inches at the widest point between the column debris and the wall, manageable for a 90-pound dog, not comfortable for a human being, but not impossible either. She went through on her side, pulling with her shoulders, and came out the other side with dust in her mouth and concrete pressing against her spine for the 2 seconds it took to clear. Garrett was on the floor, 6 feet beyond the debris point. He was conscious she registered that immediately. His eyes were open and tracking. His right leg was at a bad angle, and there was blood on the side of his face from something that had grazed him, but he was breathing, and he was looking at her. And the look on his face when she came through that gap was the specific look of someone who has been alone in the dark for 3 minutes and has just been given a reason to stay focused. Rex was pressed against his left side, still making the low sound, Garrett said with the particular dry steadiness of a man running on adrenaline. The dog found me before I even heard anyone. I know, she said. She was already running her hands along his leg, assessing, not asking him how much it hurt, because that wasn't the information she needed. His name is Rex. He's very good at his job. Yeah. Garrett's voice was tight with pain. I noticed. She looked at the column debris, looked at the corridor geometry, looked at Garrett's leg. I can't carry you through the gap. Your leg won't tolerate the angle. She raised her voice toward the debris. Holt. Holt's voice came through from the other side. Right here. We need the gap widened by 8 inches minimum. The column section has 2 contact points with the floor. If your men lift the east contact point 6 inches and hold it, I can move Garrett through. A pause. Then, that's going to be load transferred to the ceiling section. For about 20 seconds, she said. Then the column is clear of the corridor and the ceiling load distributes back to the wall. 20 seconds. A longer pause. Cole's outside, Holt said. He just got back to base. She didn't miss a beat. Is he going to be lifting or is Sergeant Pryor? She heard something on the other side that might have been a sound of surprise. Then, Pryor and Mendez on the lift. Ready when you say. She put her hand on Garrett's arm. This is going to hurt, she said directly. I'm not going to tell you it won't, but it's going to be fast. Look at Rex. Garrett looked at Rex. Rex looked back at him with the complete, undivided, uncomplicated attention of an animal who had decided this person mattered and was not going to take his eyes off him. Garrett's breathing steadied. Ready, he said. She called it lift. They had Garrett out in 18 seconds, not 20. 18. Rex came through last shaking concrete dust out of his coat with the businesslike efficiency of a dog who had done a job and finished it, and he came directly to Lena's side and sat down and looked up at her with an expression that in a human being would have been called satisfaction. She crouched down and put both hands on the sides of his head. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He pushed his forehead against hers and held it there. The 2 operators, Holt and Pryor, stood 3 feet away, watching this, and neither of them said a word. Pryor's face was doing something with its muscles that the man clearly hadn't given it permission to do. Medical arrived 60 seconds later and took Garrett, who went with them without protest, except for looking back once at Lena and once at Rex with an expression she'd remember. Then Cole was there. Nag. He came through the crowd that had gathered at the building perimeter, handlers, operators, base personnel, and he stopped 4 feet from her and he looked at Rex. The base was quiet around that small radius of space between them. People had stopped talking, not because anyone organized it, because something in the quality of the moment made noise feel inappropriate. Cole looked at Rex for a long time. Rex didn't react to him, didn't growl, didn't posture, just sat beside Lena with his shoulder against her leg and watched Cole with the calm, direct attention of a dog who had been afraid of this man for 8 months and had somehow, in the last 3 weeks, found his way back to something that fear could no longer reach. Cole looked at Lena. His face was different from anything she'd seen on it before. Not the controlled anger, not the calculation, not the performance of authority. Something had gone out of it and what was left was older and less defended. He said, "Is he all right?" She blinked. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, that was not one of them. "He's fine." Cole looked at Rex again. He didn't move toward the dog. He just looked at him the way a man looks at something he has been carrying wrong for a long time and has only now noticed the weight. "Garrett," he said. "Stable. Fractured tibia probable. He's with medical." Cole nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. Around them the crowd had thinned slightly, people drifting back to their duties, but Holt was still there, and Pryor and Ortega at the edge of the group watching. Cole said, "I watched from the perimeter when you unclipped him." He paused. I was going to stop you." "I know," she said. "I should have stopped you. Protocol for a compromised structure is—" "Garrett would still be in there," she said. "And the ceiling section was giving. You know that." Another pause. Longer. "Yes," Cole said. "I know that." The word landed like something laid down rather than something said. He looked at Rex one more time. Then he turned and walked toward the operations building without another word. Ortega appeared at Lena's shoulder. "That was the closest I've ever seen Mason Cole come to saying something real," he said quietly. She watched Cole's back. "It's not enough," she said. "Not yet." But something in her voice said it was closer than it had been this morning. Waverly called a formal all-hands at 1400. This was unusual enough that the operations room was standing room. By the time it started, Handler's Operators Base, Administrative Staff, the civilian contractor Henley, who had reappeared with his clipboard and his carefully neutral expression. Cole stood to the left of the room. Lena stood against the back wall with Ortega and Martinez beside her. Carver was near the front, his posture contained and upright. Waverly stood at the front of the room. He began with the standard framework procedural language oversight terminology, the verbal architecture of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms like this and knew exactly how to control them. He talked about program review, about documentation standards, about welfare protocol alignment. And then he stopped. It was a deliberate stop, not losing his place, not a technical pause. He stopped and looked at the room, and then he said something nobody had expected. "I'd like to speak about what happened this morning, not the structural incident, the hour before it." The room was completely still. "I came to this base this morning with the intention of managing a situation," he said. "I want to be specific about that word managing, not investigating, not evaluating, managing, which in the context I'm describing means containing the procedural consequences of documentation that was filed yesterday." He paused. "I made an offer to a base intelligence officer that was designed to create a conflict of interest. I want that acknowledged in the official record of this meeting." The silence that followed was the kind that had no precedent in the room's memory. Cole turned his head and looked at Waverly. Waverly looked back at him. The documentation filed by Ms. Cross, Lieutenant Carver Handler Martinez, and Sergeant Ortega describes a pattern of record alteration that occurred at this facility and that I was peripherally aware of through my role on the oversight board. My awareness and my failure to act on it is a form of institutional complicity that the investigation now underway will need to evaluate. He held the room steady with a voice that had the particular quality of someone who had decided somewhere before he walked into this room to stop running a calculation that wasn't producing anything worth having. "I will cooperate fully with that investigation, and I am placing this program under immediate independent review, effective this afternoon." He looked at Cole. Cole said nothing. Ortega's hand touched Lena's arm briefly. A small gesture, barely contact, the kind that means, "Did you know this was coming?" She gave a small shake of her head. She hadn't. Waverly had made a decision somewhere between the conversation with Carver this morning and this room this afternoon. She didn't know exactly what had moved him, whether it was the NCIS flag or Carver's refusal of the offer, or something in the math of his own career that he'd run and not liked the answer of. Maybe all of it. Maybe something smaller that she'd never know about. She didn't need to know. It was done. Garrett's voice came into her head. "The dog found me before I even heard anyone," and she felt something settle in her chest that had been braced for impact since she'd walked through that base gate 3 weeks ago. Then Cole spoke. "I'd like to say something," he said. The room turned toward him. He didn't look like a man who had planned this. He looked like a man who had arrived at a point he hadn't known was coming until he was already standing at it. He looked, Lena thought, like someone whose armor had been load-bearing and had just quietly given way. "The training program I built here," he started. Then he stopped, started differently. "The dogs in this program are military assets. That's how I was trained to think about them, and that's how I've managed this unit for 12 years. Assets are evaluated on performance. Assets that don't perform are replaced." He paused. "I knew that framework was incomplete. I've known it for a long time. But incomplete frameworks are very useful if you need to justify decisions you've already made." His jaw tightened. Rex's neurological injury was in Martinez's report the day it happened. I removed it from the file because Rex was one of my top-performing assets, and a neurological evaluation would have pulled him from the rotation for minimum 90 days, and we had a certification cycle in 6 weeks. He looked at Martinez. "I told myself it was a judgment call. I told myself the injury wasn't severe enough to warrant." He stopped himself. "I altered a document to protect a metric. That's what it was, not a judgment call." Martinez looked at the floor. "Nova's mission report," Cole continued. "Ortega filed it completely and accurately. I removed the pages that described the command failure that sent her back into the compound because the officer who gave that command was a colonel with oversight capacity over this program, and a report that documented his operational error would have created consequences I didn't want to manage. He paused. I told myself I was protecting the program. I was protecting myself. His voice hadn't broken, but it had changed. It had the quality of something being said for the first time out loud, in the particular way that first tellings have a different weight than all the ones that came after. 2 animals sustained injuries that were then systematically attributed to character defects they didn't have, and I let that happen. The room held its breath. Then Cole looked at Lena. She met his eyes. He said, "You knew all of this before you walked through the gate." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, said with a kind of tired recognition. "I knew there was a pattern," she said. "I didn't know the specifics until I got here." "Who sent you?" She held his gaze. "Nobody sent me. I requested the transfer." A pause. "Rex and Nova are descended from bloodlines I worked with in a program that no longer exists. When that program was shut down, I made a promise about what happened to the animals that came out of it." She said it simply without performance. "I've been keeping that promise." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "Project Sentinel," he said. The room didn't react because nobody in it knew the name. But Cole said it like a man who had finally found a word for something he'd been looking at for 3 weeks without being able to name it. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out the performance evaluation he'd written on her, the one with the official signature, the one that would have triggered her access freeze, and he set it on the table beside him, face up. He looked at it for a moment. Then he tore it in half. Nobody in the room made a sound. Holt, standing along the wall, pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Pryor turned his head slightly. The effort was visible, and the effort was real. Waverly said quietly, "For the record, I'm noting Chief Cole's cooperation with the review process as a mitigating factor in the investigation." Cole said nothing. He looked at the 2 halves of the document on the table. He looked like a man at the bottom of something standing on solid ground for the first time in a while, finding his footing. She went to Rex that evening, not for a training session, not for documentation, just to be there the way she'd been there at 5:15 every morning since the first week before the base woke up and the day's machinery started moving. Except now it was evening, and the Arizona sky outside the kennel windows was going deep orange and red, and Rex was at the front of his enclosure the moment he heard her come through the door. She sat down on the kennel floor, and he came to her immediately, the full weight of him pressing against her, and she wrapped her arms around his shoulders and held on. And for a moment she didn't think about the investigation, or Waverly's statement, or Cole's torn document, or any of it. She just thought about a dog in Kandahar who had done his job perfectly, and come home to a world that had decided his confusion was a defect. She thought about 4 years of Project Sentinel, the dogs they'd taken in, the animals that everyone else had written the paperwork on, and the methods she'd built from nothing, from stubbornness, and an unwillingness to accept that trauma was the same thing as failure. She thought about Hargrove's voice on the phone. That's why Sentinel existed. Rex breathed slowly against her. After a while, Martinez appeared in the kennel doorway. He stood there for a moment without saying anything. She looked up. His face was the face of a man who had been carrying something heavy for 11 months and had set it down today and wasn't entirely sure yet what he felt without the weight. "Garrett's asking about Rex," he said. "From medical. He wants to know if there's a protocol for thanking a dog." She looked at Rex. "Tell him to come find us tomorrow morning. I'll show him." Martinez nodded. He started to go. "Martinez." She waited until he turned back. "The report you reconstructed from your notes. The one you signed with your name." She held his gaze. "That took guts. I want you to know that I know that." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have held the line 11 months ago," he said. "In Kandahar. When Cole said to reclassify. You were one handler in a system that was telling you to be quiet," she said. You're speaking now. That's what counts. He considered that. Not agreeing too quickly, actually considering it. Turning it over the way a person does when they're trying to decide if they've earned the absolution they're being offered. The investigation, he said. Waverly said independent review. You know what that means for Cole? Yes, she said. And for Waverly? Yes. And for the 12 other bases under that oversight board. He paused. This goes a lot further than Echo 7. I know, she said. It always did. Martinez was quiet for a moment more. Then he nodded once and walked out of the kennel. She stayed with Rex. In the kennel next to his, through the wall that separated the restricted housing from the main block, she could hear Nova. Not the absent sound, the silence that had been there when she first arrived. Something different. Movement. A dog adjusting her position, settling the ordinary sounds of an animal that had decided the room was safe enough to exist in. One room at a time. Lena put her chin on top of Rex's head and listened to Nova breathe on the other side of the wall. And in the quiet of that moment before tomorrow, and the investigation, and all the institutional machinery that was about to start moving, she let herself feel what 3 weeks of controlled forward motion had held at a distance. The relief. The grief for the time already lost. The specific ache of having been right about something you would rather have been wrong about. Rex pressed closer. She held on. Outside, the desert light was gone now, and the base had settled into its nighttime rhythms, and somewhere in the operations building, a document with Cole's torn signature was lying on a table, and somewhere in a JAG system, a case number was attached to the testimony of 4 people who had decided that accurate records mattered more than comfortable ones. And in Building 7, the cleared debris was already being assessed by the structural team. And in the medical bay, a man with a fractured tibia was asking about a dog. Lena Cross sat on a concrete kennel floor with a Belgian Malinois pressed against her chest, and she thought, this is what it costs, and this is what it's worth, and I would do every single day of it again. She stayed until Rex fell asleep. Then she stood up carefully so she wouldn't wake him, and she walked toward the morning that was already building somewhere out past the dark. The NCIS investigators arrived on a Tuesday. 2 of them, a man named Reyes and a woman named Park, showed up at 0800 in civilian vehicles with federal credentials and the particular unhurried efficiency of people who already had everything they needed and were simply here to confirm it. They set up in the base conference room, requested the documentation Carver and Lena had compiled, and began. They didn't start with Cole. They started with the dogs. Reyes asked to see Rex and Nova personally on the first morning, and Lena brought them both Nova on a long lead because she wasn't ready for open field work yet. Rex walking free at Lena's side the way he'd been doing for the past week. The investigator crouched down in front of Rex and looked at him with the careful attention of someone who had been briefed on the case but hadn't understood it fully until this moment. This is the dog the reports called chronically aggressive, Reyes said. It wasn't quite a question. That's what the altered documentation said, Lena confirmed. Reyes watched Rex sit calmly, eyes forward, the absolute stillness of a dog who had nothing to prove and nothing to fear. And the German Shepherd. Nova, diagnosed behavioral shutdown. Cole's retirement recommendation called her a program liability. Lena looked at Nova, who was standing at the end of her lead with her ears forward and her eyes tracking Reyes's face with something that was not quite engagement yet, but was something close to its edge. She ate a full meal this morning, 2nd full meal in a row. Reyes stood up and looked at Lena with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. How, he said, did you know they could come back? She thought about it for a moment. Because I'd seen it before, she said, and because trauma and damage are different things. Damaged is permanent. Trauma is a response to something that happened. Responses can change when the conditions change. She paused. Rex and Nova weren't broken. They were answering the only way they knew how to the things that had been done to them. Change the environment, change the answer. Reyes wrote something in his notebook. Then he looked up. You're going to need to say all of that on record. I know, she said. I've been ready. Yikai. The formal interviews ran for 4 days. Martinez went first. He sat across from Park for 2.5 hours, and he told everything Kandahar the field medical report, Cole's instruction to reclassify the 11 months of watching Rex's behavioral deterioration attributed to everything except its actual cause. He told it in the flat, precise way he'd told it to Lena in the pre-dawn dark 6 weeks ago, and she could tell from the quality of Park's silence that she understood the cost of what Martinez was putting on the table. When he came out of the conference room, he looked lighter. Not happy lighter wasn't the same thing as happy. Lighter was what happened when you'd been holding something at a specific angle for a long time and finally set it down flat. Ortega went next. He told the Kandahar mission, the IED cache, Nova's injury, the command failure, the 2 missing pages. He named the officer who had given the order to move past the cache, and he said it clearly without hedging, because he'd made the decision during his first conversation with Lena that clarity was what he owed and he was going to pay it in full. When he came out, he found Lena in the corridor and said, "They asked me why I didn't report the missing pages when it happened." "What did you say?" "I told them I was afraid." He said it without decoration. That's the truth. I was afraid of what it would cost me. I told myself it was one mission, one dog, that the damage was done, and reporting wouldn't undo it. He looked at her steadily. "They asked me if I thought that was the right decision." "What did you say?" "I told them no." His voice was even. "And that I was glad I had the chance to say so now." She nodded once. Cole's interview lasted 6 hours across 2 days. She didn't hear the content directly. Nobody did. It was closed door. But she saw him go in both mornings, and she saw him come out both afternoons, and the man who came out on the second afternoon looked measurably different from the man who had stood at the edge of the training field 3 weeks ago and told her she was standing on thin ground. He didn't look broken. He looked like someone who had put something down and was figuring out how to stand without it. Lena's own interview lasted 3 hours. She told them everything she could tell them. Her methodology. Her observations from the 3 weeks at Echo 7. What she'd seen in the training sessions in the kennels in the documentation she'd reviewed. She told them about Project Sentinel in the terms she was cleared to describe the rehabilitation methods, the outcomes, the reason the program had succeeded with animals that conventional training had given up on. When it was over, Reyes set down his pen and looked at her directly. "I've worked military welfare investigations for 11 years, he said. "I've never had a case where the primary evidence walked on 4 legs. She almost smiled. "Rex and Nova couldn't file a complaint," she said. "Somebody had to." The investigation findings came down 3 weeks after the NCIS team left the base. She heard the summary from Hargrove, who called her the morning the report was finalized. She stood outside the kennel building in the early light with the phone against her ear, and she listened. Chief Mason Cole, formal misconduct finding. Deliberate alteration of official military records. Dereliction of duty in animal welfare oversight. Recommended reduction in rank, mandatory retirement, no honorable service commendation. Colonel Waverly, formal investigation finding for oversight board negligence and complicity in record concealment. Recommended removal from oversight board position, administrative review of all certification decisions made under his board tenure at 14 facilities. 12 other bases under Waverly's board ordered into independent welfare review. And then Hargrove said, "The DoD Animal Welfare Standards Committee has requested that you present your methodology to them at the Pentagon in 6 weeks. Not as a witness, as an expert advisor." She was quiet for a moment. "They want a briefing." "They want more than a briefing," Hargrove said. "They're talking about a formal protocol revision, new standards for psychological welfare assessment in military working dog programs across all branches." A pause. "Your name is attached to the draft framework, Lena. This is bigger than Echo 7. She leaned against the kennel building wall and looked at the sky for a moment. "Rex and Nova," she said. "Their cases. Both files fully restored with accurate documentation," Hargrove said. "The retirement recommendations are rescinded. Their official records show handler trauma response, not behavioral failure. Martinez's original field report is reinstated in full." She exhaled. "There's one more thing," Hargrove said. His voice had a different quality now. "Careful. The Oversight Board review is going to identify other animals at other facilities who were managed the same way. Dogs with behavioral flags in their files that may be masking undisclosed injuries. The question is who addresses those cases." He paused. "They're asking if you'd lead it." The silence stretched for a long moment. "All 14 facilities," she said. "However many need it," Hargrove said. "You'd have formal authority, resources, a team you could build from scratch." He paused. "It's not what you signed up for when you transferred to Echo 7. "No," she said. "It's what came after what I signed up for." Another pause. "I'll do it," she said. She told Ortega that afternoon. He was on the training field running Duke Carver's Shepherd, whose certification had been formally approved 2 days after Waverly's statement, processed in 48 hours, by a board that suddenly had no reason to delay it. Duke moved beautifully on the field, all the compressed energy of a dog who had been waiting to work and was finally working, and Ortega ran him through the sequence with the easy competence of a man who was very good at what he did. He brought Duke in when he saw her at the field edge, and he looked at her face and said, "Big news." "Pentagon briefing in 6 weeks," she said. "And then a team. 14 facilities." Ortega looked at her for a moment. "You're leaving Echo 7. "Eventually. There's work to finish here first." She watched Duke circle back and press against Ortega's leg. "Carver's been working with Duke every morning this week. He's good. He's very good," Ortega said. "Natural instinct. He just needed someone to tell him his read on the dog was right." He paused. "Like a lot of people around here?" She looked at him. "I'm going to ask you something, and you don't have to answer today." "Okay. The team I'm building. I need people who understand both the operational side and the welfare side, who know what working dogs actually need because they've spent real time in the field with them and know what the field costs." She held his gaze. "I need someone who can walk into a program the way I walked into this one and see it clearly." Ortega was quiet for a long moment. Duke sat at his feet and looked up at him with the simple patience of an animal who had no interest in the complexity of what the humans around him were deciding. "That's a significant ask," Ortega said. "I know. Leaving my unit, starting something that doesn't have a track record yet." "Correct." He looked at Duke. He looked at the training field. He looked at the operations building where 3 weeks ago he'd stood in a corridor and read a performance evaluation written to end Lena's career and had decided to tell her about it instead of staying quiet. "I'll need 2 weeks to arrange the transfer," he said. She nodded. He turned back to the field, and then he said without turning around, "For what it's worth, I've been in this unit for 2 years. I've never seen Rex run a search the way he ran it in Building 7. Not even in his best evaluation days before Kandahar." He paused. "Whatever you gave him back, that wasn't just training." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He didn't ask what it was. He already knew. On her last full week at Echo 7, Garrett came to find her. He was on crutches, the fractured tibia was clean, and the prognosis was good, but it required time. And he was walking carefully with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being slow and was managing his impatience with varying degrees of success. He found her in the restricted kennel block with Nova. Nova had crossed a threshold 2 days before. She had taken food directly from Lena's hand, which didn't sound like much unless you understood what it meant. An animal in shutdown, choosing contact, choosing to accept something from a person. It was the first voluntary choice Nova had made in months, and Lena had sat with the weight of it for a long time after. Now Nova was at the kennel door when Lena came in and she was moving. Not the bounded, anxious movement of a stressed dog, but a looser, slower movement that had something in it that was starting to resemble the dog she'd been in the first 22 minutes of the Kandahar footage. Garrett stood in the doorway and watched. "That's Nova," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't look like the file." The file was wrong. He nodded slowly. He looked at Nova for a long time. Then he said, "I heard about the investigation findings. Cole." "Yes." "I worked under Cole for 2 years," Garrett said. His voice was careful, measured. "He ran a hard program. But I never thought—" He stopped. "When you're inside a system that functions, it's very hard to see what the functioning costs. You just see the output." He paused. "The dogs. I never asked. I should have asked." She looked at him steadily. "You didn't know to ask. That's not the same as an excuse." "No," she said. "It's not. But it's a reason, and reasons matter because they tell you what changes to make going forward." She let Nova sniff her knuckles through the kennel door. "You know now. That's what you do with it." Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to apologize to Rex." She turned and looked at him. He said it plainly, no performance in it, no self-conscious awkwardness. He meant it, and the straightforwardness of it was more effective than anything more elaborate would have been. "He's in the main kennel block," she said. "Come on." Rex took one look at Garrett on his crutches and moved toward the kennel door with his tail describing a slow, loose arc. Garrett crouched down carefully, bad leg extended, one crutch propped against the kennel wall, and put his hand through the gate. Rex came to it immediately. Garrett held his hand there, and Rex pressed his nose against it, and then his whole face, and Garrett's other hand came up and scratched behind the dog's ears, with the particular certainty of someone who has been around dogs all his life and knows exactly where they want to be touched. He didn't say anything to Rex for a moment. He just stayed there, and Rex stayed with him, and Lena stood back and watched, and didn't interrupt it, because some things needed the space they took. Then Garrett said quietly to the dog, "You came back for me." Rex's tail moved once, slow and full. Garrett exhaled. He pressed the heel of his free hand against his left eye for a second, a fast, contained gesture, and then he straightened up, retrieved his crutch, and looked at Lena. "Whatever you're building," he said, "after you leave here, the team, the new standards, if there's ever a place for someone who can work the field side and won't make the same mistakes twice. Get your leg cleared first," she said. "Then call me." He nodded once. He looked at Rex one more time. "Good dog," he said. Rex sat down and looked at him with the calm, complete confidence of an animal who had come all the way back from the place fear had taken him and was standing now on solid ground. The morning she left Echo 7, Cole was waiting at the gate. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected to drive out the way she'd driven, in unremarked, unannounced, just another departure. Cole had been quiet since his second day of interviews, moving through the base in a different register than before. Not invisible exactly, but smaller. A man who had given up a great deal of weight and was learning to occupy his own space without it. She stopped when she saw him. He was in civilian clothes, not fatigues, not the command uniform, jeans and a gray jacket. He looked, she realized, like a person she might have passed on a street without recognizing, and that was strange, because he had been large in her landscape for the past month, in the way mountains are large. "I know you're leaving," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The base was beginning its morning routine behind her. She could hear it. The familiar sounds of 0600 at a military facility. The sounds she'd gotten up before every day for a month to beat to the kennel. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you," he said. She waited. "I've commanded military working dog programs for 12 years, he said. "I've watched a lot of animals come through this system. Good ones, great ones. Dogs that performed under conditions that should have broken them and didn't." He paused. "I told myself that meant I understood them. I told myself that results were the same thing as understanding." His jaw worked for a moment. Watching Rex in that building, watching him find Garrett and stay with him in the dark. He stopped, started differently. He didn't do that because he was trained to. He did it because he trusted you, and because you'd spent 3 weeks making it possible for him to trust anyone again. He looked at her. "I didn't build that. 12 years of my program didn't build that. 3 weeks of yours did." She said nothing. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she recognized that this wasn't a moment that needed one. "I'm not asking for absolution," Cole said. "I know what I did, and I know what it cost. I'm going to live with that." He held her gaze. "I just want you to know that I saw it. Finally, what trust does that fear can't?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Rex and Nova are going to be fine," she said. "I want you to know that." He nodded once. Something moved through his face and was gone. "Take care of them," he said. "I will," she said. She drove out of the gate. 6 weeks later, she stood at a podium in the Pentagon. The room was full animal welfare officers program, commanders, veterinary specialists, congressional liaisons, 2 members of a Senate subcommittee on military operational standards. People who made decisions about policy that rippled out into 14 facilities and several hundred military working dogs and the handlers who depended on them. She had prepared a briefing document, 14 pages specific and detailed, covering the methodology she'd developed through Project Sentinel and refined at Echo 7. Psychological welfare indicators, trauma response identification, rehabilitation protocols, proposed changes to certification standards that replaced performance metrics alone with integrated welfare assessment scoring. She had the briefing document. She set it face down on the podium. Then she said, "I want to tell you about a dog named Rex." The room listened. She told them the whole story, not the methodology first, the dog first. Rex in Kandahar, Rex coming home from an injury that was logged as something else. Rex in 8 months of behavioral deterioration that everyone around him called aggression, because the system he was inside didn't have language for what was actually happening to him. Rex on the first morning in the cage and the check command, and the way he sat down. Not because he was dominated, but because something in him recognized something in her that said, "This is safe." She told them about Nova lying on a bare concrete floor with her eyes somewhere else. She told them about Garrett in the dark, and Rex pressing his head through the kennel door, and the specific, uncomplicated fidelity of a dog who had been given a reason to try again. She told them, "The animals in our military programs are not equipment. They are not assets in the conventional sense of that word. They are living systems capable of loyalty, of fear, of trauma, and of recovery. They go where we send them. They do what we train them to do. They do not have the option of filing a complaint when something goes wrong, or requesting a transfer when a system fails them, or asking why the record of what happened to them was changed." She paused. "They need someone to do that for them, and right now our standards don't require it." She reached into the briefing document and held up one page, the proposed welfare assessment framework, 2 paragraphs that distilled everything she'd learned into language a policy document could hold. "This is what I'm asking you to change," she said. "Not the mission, not the operational standards, the accounting. I'm asking you to account for the whole cost, not just whether the dog's certified, but whether the dog is okay." The room was quiet. One of the Senate liaisons, a woman named Calloway, who had been taking notes throughout, looked up and said, "What happened to Rex after Echo 7? Lena looked at her. "He's being retrained for a new assignment," she said. "Welfare assessment and demonstration work. He'll travel with me to the facilities we're reviewing." She paused. "He's the best possible argument for everything in this framework. Living proof that what we think is broken is sometimes just waiting for the right conditions to recover." Calloway wrote something down. The briefing lasted 2 hours. When it ended and the room began its normal reshuffling, Reyes, the NCIS investigator who had been sitting along the back wall, came to find her. "Calloway's office is going to move on the framework," he said. "Not the full protocol revision immediately, but a pilot program. 8 facilities. Your team leads the assessments." She absorbed that. 8. To start. He looked at her. "Cole's replacement at Echo 7 has already requested to be one of the 8. She looked at him. "Who replaced him?" "Ortega," Reyes said. "Temporary command pending permanent appointment. The recommendation from base command was unanimous." She stood with that for a moment. Ortega, the man who'd been watching from the field edge on the first morning, who'd been saying for 4 months that Rex wasn't a bad dog, who had sat in a conference room and told the truth with his name attached to it. Ortega in command. "He'll be good," she said. "I know," Reyes said. "He already scheduled Duke for full active certification." She almost smiled. Of course he did. 3 months after she left, Echo 7 Nova was cleared for supervised fieldwork. Martinez called her to tell her. Not a report, a phone call at 1900 on a Thursday, his voice carrying the specific quality of someone who had good news and had been looking forward to delivering it. "She marked a training cache today," he said. "Clean approach. Clean mark. Held the position for full protocol time." He paused. First time since before Kandahar. Lena sat down on the edge of her bunk in the temporary housing at her current facility. Facility 3 of the 8A base in Virginia, where the welfare review was 3 weeks in and already producing documentation that was going to change 6 handlers' approaches to their animals before the month was out. "How did she look?" Lena said. "Like herself," Martinez said simply. "Like the dog she was before all of it." She pressed her free hand flat against her knee and breathed slowly. "Martinez," she said. "Thank you for calling." "I owed you more than a call," he said. "But it's a start." She sat with the phone for a moment after he hung up. Then she got up and went to find Rex. He was in the facility kennel in the space she'd arranged for him. That was his now, not a restriction enclosure, not a behavioral holding area, but a regular working dog kennel with a proper bed and a handler schedule, and a certification record that said in plain official language, healthy, stable, active duty, capable. He heard her coming before she reached the door. He was at the front of the kennel when she got there. Tail moving, the whole rear half of him engaged in the particular full-body greeting of a dog who is genuinely glad, who isn't performing gladness, but actually feeling it, which is a distinction only visible if you know what you're looking at. She opened the kennel door, and he came out, and he went up front, paused briefly on her shoulders, which she allowed because he'd earned it, and because the pure, uncomplicated joy of a dog who trusts completely was not something she had any interest in suppressing. She held him for a moment, both hands on his sides, and then he dropped back to the ground and sat and looked up at her with those amber eyes that had once looked at the world with the frantic, unfocused panic of an animal who couldn't make sense of anything. Clear now, completely clear. "Good boy," she said. She clipped his lead. She walked out into the evening. Tomorrow, there were 2 more handler interviews scheduled, and a kennel assessment, and a documentation review that was going to require 4 hours of focused reading. There were 7 more facilities after this one, and a Senate subcommittee meeting in 8 weeks, and a framework revision draft sitting on her laptop that needed 3 more sections before it could go to the standards committee. There was a great deal of work still ahead. There always was. But Rex walked beside her in the evening air, with the loose, easy stride of a dog who had come back from the worst of what humans could do by mistake, and found on the other side of it exactly what he'd always been. And she felt with a certainty that lived below reasoning and below argument that the work was right, and the cost was worth it, and the truth they had established together, the 4 of them, Ortega and Martinez and Carver and her, with 2 dogs, as the living evidence, was the kind of truth that didn't shrink once it was spoken aloud. It only grew. A combat dog is not a machine. It feels fear and pain and loyalty. And the moment you stop treating that loyalty with the respect it deserves, you don't create warriors. You create wounds that no one can see until they've gone too deep to deny. Rex had shown them what healing looked like. The rest of the work was making sure he was never the last one who had to prove it.